My name is Elena Marsh, and for 6 years, I did not speak to my parents. Not because of some small argument that spiraled out of control, not because of money, not because of a boyfriend they disapproved of. I stopped speaking to them because every time I said my grandmother's name, my mother's face would turn to stone and my father would leave the room. "She's gone, Elena," my mother would say, her voice flat as a closed door. "Grieving her again and again isn't healthy." But something about the way they said it never sat right with me. Grief softens with time. Anger doesn't. And what I saw in my parents' eyes whenever Grandma Ruth's name came up wasn't grief. It was fear. I was 12 when they told me she died. There was no funeral I attended, no body I saw, only a phone call from my father telling me she had passed peacefully in her sleep somewhere upstate and that arrangements had already been handled quietly, out of respect for her wishes. I remember asking why I couldn't say goodbye. I remember my mother telling me some things were better left alone. For years, I obeyed that instruction. I built my own life, far from my parents' influence, working as a museum archivist in a city 3 hours from the estate I grew up visiting as a child. I told myself the ache I felt whenever I thought of my grandmother was simply grief that had never fully closed. I didn't know that ache was actually instinct, screaming at me that something had been buried that was never meant to be buried at all. My younger sister Claire stayed close to our parents. She always had. She believed the family script without question, accepted the version of events handed to her, and in exchange received approval, comfort, and a place inside the family's good graces that I had long since lost. We weren't close, not anymore. Every conversation between us felt like she was reading from a script our parents had written for her. It was Claire who came to me that spring afternoon with a request that would unravel everything. "They asked me to do something strange," she said over the phone, her voice hesitant in a way I wasn't used to hearing from her. "They want me to drive out to your place and take photos of your house, inside if I can manage it." Why would they want that? "They said you might be holding on to documents, old ones from Grandma's estate, papers that could affect the sale of the family property." They didn't explain much more than that. I felt my stomach tighten. My parents had been trying to sell the old family estate for over a year, the enormous house Grandma Ruth once lived in before she supposedly died. I had no documents. I had nothing but a hollow ache and a lifetime of unanswered questions. But something about my parents sending Claire to spy on me, rather than simply asking me themselves, told me this was about far more than paperwork. "Come," I told her, "but don't take pictures. Just come talk to me." She agreed, though I could tell she intended to do exactly what our parents asked, at least partly, out of the same old loyalty that had defined her whole life. I didn't blame her for it. I understood the pull of wanting to belong somewhere, even if that somewhere was built on lies. Claire arrived at my house on a bright Saturday morning, camera in hand, looking uncertain about the whole errand. My house sits at the edge of a quiet countryside road with an overgrown garden along the side that I'd been slowly restoring since I moved in. She stepped out of her car, camera raised out of habit rather than intention, framing the front of my house through the lens. Then she saw the garden. An elderly woman knelt among the flower beds, wearing a wide straw hat, her hands stained with soil, humming softly to herself as she worked. Claire lowered the camera slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen photographs of this woman 1,000 times growing up. She had heard her voice in home videos our parents kept locked in a drawer, videos she wasn't supposed to know existed. She recognized the tilt of the woman's head, the particular way she hummed old songs under her breath while gardening, exactly as she remembered from childhood summers at the estate. It was our grandmother, the woman who had supposedly been dead for over 2 decades. Claire told me later that she stood frozen for what felt like several minutes, unable to move, unable to speak, the camera hanging loosely from her fingers. The elderly woman finally looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and studied Claire's face with an expression that held no surprise at all, only a quiet, tired resignation. "I wondered how long it would take for one of you to find me," she said. I came outside when I heard Claire's voice break into sobs and found my sister kneeling in the dirt beside our grandmother, both of them holding on to each other as though they were afraid the other might vanish if they let go. That was the day the truth finally cracked open. Grandma Ruth had been living quietly in a small cottage on my property for nearly 3 years, a fact I had kept from everyone in my family, including Claire. I had found her long before that, 5 years earlier, living in isolation in a rundown assisted facility 2 states away, placed there under a false name, visited by no one. Her existence slowly erased from every official record my parents could touch. I had spent years secretly caring for her, moving her closer to me, giving her the dignity and companionship my parents had stripped away the moment they decided she had outlived her usefulness to them. She told us everything that afternoon, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was revealing. Over 2 decades earlier, shortly after my grandfather passed away, my parents had discovered that Grandma Ruth intended to rewrite her will. She had grown suspicious of certain business dealings my father had entangled the family fortune in, dealings that skirted the edges of legality and threatened to expose him if pursued to their natural conclusion. She planned to redirect significant portions of the estate away from my parents entirely, placing it instead into a trust meant to protect the family's remaining wealth from further risk. My parents could not allow that to happen. They convinced her, through months of psychological pressure, isolation, and manipulation, that she was becoming forgetful, unstable, a danger to herself. They hired people to reinforce this narrative to outside observers while simultaneously cutting her off from friends, staff, and any relative who might have questioned her sudden absence. When she resisted their attempts to gain power of attorney over her affairs, they staged her death entirely. A closed casket funeral attended only by close family and a handful of paid witnesses. Fabricated medical records, a death certificate obtained through connections my father had cultivated for exactly this kind of emergency. With Grandma Ruth legally dead, my parents inherited everything without contest, free to manage, sell, and redistribute the family's assets however they pleased, with no one left alive officially to challenge them. Claire sat in stunned silence as our grandmother spoke, her hands trembling in her lap. I watched years of unquestioning loyalty crumble across my sister's face, replaced by a dawning horror at what she had nearly participated in that very morning. "They sent me here to find proof that Elena was hiding something," Claire said quietly. They were terrified she had documents that could undo everything they built on top of this lie. "She does," Grandma Ruth said, glancing toward me with the faintest trace of a smile. "She has me." Over the following weeks, Claire became something none of us expected. Rather than returning to our parents with empty hands and a fabricated excuse, she chose to turn against the very system that had shaped her entire life. She began quietly recording conversations with our parents, documenting the panic in their voices whenever the topic of the estate sale intensified, capturing admissions they never intended to make aloud. She found paperwork hidden inside a locked cabinet in our father's study, forged signatures on property transfer documents dated years after Grandma Ruth's supposed death, financial records showing the systematic liquidation of assets that were never legally theirs to touch. Former household staff, people who had once worked at the family estate and had long suspected something was wrong, came forward once Claire reached out to them, offering testimonies about strange instructions they'd been given, about a woman they were told never to mention again. Grandma Ruth hired an attorney, a sharp and quietly relentless woman named Diane Castillo, who had handled complex estate fraud cases before and recognized immediately the scale of what my parents had constructed. Authorities opened an investigation into the forged property transfers. The fabricated death certificate was flagged and scrutinized. Piece by piece, the elaborate lie my parents had maintained for over 2 decades began to unravel under the weight of its own contradictions. The case eventually reached the courtroom, and I will never forget the moment Grandma Ruth walked through those doors, standing tall despite her age, despite everything taken from her. A hush fell over the room as recognition spread from face to face. Distant relatives who had attended her funeral years earlier stared in open disbelief. My parents, seated at the defense table, went pale, their carefully constructed composure finally breaking apart in front of everyone who had once believed their version of events. The judge, reviewing documentation showing millions of dollars in assets transferred and liquidated after Ruth's supposed death, asked a simple but devastating question. How does a dead woman's signature appear on documents dated years after her funeral? The silence that followed answered more clearly than any testimony could have. Fraud charges followed swiftly. The forged property transfers were reversed through the courts. The portions of the estate stolen through years of manipulation were returned to their rightful place, under Grandma Ruth's control once again, exactly as she had originally intended before her family betrayed her trust in the cruelest way imaginable. Claire stood before both of us not long after the trial concluded, her voice thick with emotion as she apologized, not just for the photographs she almost took, but for years of blind loyalty that had allowed our parents' lies to persist unchallenged. It wasn't an easy conversation, and the wounds between us didn't heal instantly, but it was a beginning neither of us had thought possible only months earlier. Grandma Ruth eventually told us why she chose silence and disappearance over a public fight all those years ago. She said she had been so devastated by her own children's willingness to erase her that she no longer believed anyone would take her side against them. She chose survival in the shadows over a battle she was certain she would lose until the day fate placed a camera in her granddaughter's hands and gave her a reason to hope again. I inherited far more than property and money in the months that followed. Grandma Ruth gave me boxes of journals she had kept throughout her years in hiding, filled with memories, family history, and the quiet wisdom of a woman who had survived betrayal without losing her spirit. We restored the old family estate together, room by room, replacing the silence that had haunted its halls with laughter that had been missing for over 20 years. Standing in that garden one final evening, watching Grandma Ruth tend to her flowers exactly as Claire had first seen her, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people decide to bury it. It waits, patiently, sometimes for decades, until someone finally has the courage to look a little closer, to ask one more question, to raise a camera toward a garden and see what was never truly gone at all.